My name is Rebecca Lawson. I'm 54 years old, and on Christmas night 2 years ago, I found my daughter shivering in a corner while her husband's family laughed by the fireplace. What I discovered that night made me realize that the worst monsters don't hide in the dark, they sit in million-dollar living rooms, wearing cashmere sweaters. I drove 4 hours through a snowstorm that December 24th because something in Sophie's voice during our last phone call wouldn't let me rest. That hesitation, that small tremor when she said she was fine, just fine. Mom. I'd heard it before, back when she was 7 and tried to hide a bad grade from me. A mother knows. When I arrived at the Whitmore mansion in Connecticut at 9 p.m., snow falling thick and heavy, I didn't go to the front door. Something told me to look through the windows first, and thank God I did. Through the panoramic window of their living room, I saw the whole picture. The massive stone fireplace crackling with warmth, crystal wine glasses catching the light, Derek's parents, Howard and Patricia Whitmore, holding court like royalty, everyone wrapped in thick sweaters and holiday cheer. And then I saw my daughter. Sophie was sitting on a wooden chair in the corner farthest from the fire, near the back door that led to the garden. She wore only a thin cotton blouse and jeans. No sweater, no blanket. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and even from outside I could see her whole body shaking. Her lips looked almost blue. As I watched, frozen in horror, Patricia said something that made everyone laugh. Sophie flinched and pulled her arms tighter, trying to disappear into herself. Derek stood right next to the fireplace in a thick cashmere sweater, champagne in hand, not even glancing in her direction. That's when I stopped being polite and started being a mother. I'm about to tell you a story about 7 years of lies, financial abuse disguised as love, and a family that believed money gave them the right to treat my brilliant daughter like a servant. This is about the night I walked into that house and took her back, about what we found when we started digging into Derek Whitmore's perfect life, and about how sometimes the only way to save someone you love is to burn down the pretty picture they've been trapped inside. This is a long and painful story, and I'll need someone to walk through it with me. If you want to hear how a mother's instinct exposed a 7-year con and destroyed a family's carefully constructed reputation, stay with me, because what I found in that mansion was just the beginning. I didn't knock politely. I pounded on that front door hard enough to make their expensive Christmas wreath swing wildly on its hook. The sound echoed through the cold night air, and I didn't stop until someone answered. Howard Whitmore opened the door. Derek's father, a tall man in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of face that's used to getting its way. He looked at me like I was something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Every instinct told me to be polite, to apologize for the intrusion, to explain myself. That's what they count on, isn't it? That we'll be too embarrassed to make a scene. But then I thought of Sophie's blue lips, and something in me shifted. "I'm Rebecca Lawson," I said, my voice steady and cold, "Sophie's mother, and I'm here to get my daughter." The look on his face, like I'd just announced I was there to rob them, would have been funny if I wasn't so furious. He didn't move. For a moment, I thought he might actually try to close the door in my face. "Now," I added, taking a step forward. He stepped aside. I walked through that marble foyer like I owned the place, my wet boots leaving tracks on their pristine floor. I didn't care. The sound of laughter and conversation from the living room got louder as I approached, and then suddenly stopped the moment I appeared in the doorway. 8 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me, but I only saw one person. Mom. Sophie's voice was so small, so broken. She looked up at me with those wide brown eyes, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years: hope, mixed with absolute terror. I crossed that room in 5 seconds. I didn't ask permission. I didn't explain. I took off my heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then pulled her against me. She was ice cold. Actually cold, like she'd been sitting outside in the snow instead of inside a heated house. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, looking around at all of them. "Why is my daughter freezing while all of you are comfortable?" Patricia Whitmore, Derek's mother, a woman who probably spent more on her haircut than most people spend on rent, let out this nervous little laugh, the kind of laugh people make when they're used to smoothing over uncomfortable situations. "Oh, Rebecca," she said, waving her hand like she was dismissing a silly notion. How dramatic. Sophie simply prefers to sit away from the fire. She told us she gets overheated easily. Didn't you, dear? She looked at Sophie with this smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a warning disguised as sweetness. I felt Sophie tense against me. Is that true, sweetheart? I asked softly, just for her. Did you ask to sit in the cold? Sophie opened her mouth, and I could see her struggling. 7 years of something had taught her not to contradict these people. But before she could answer, Derek stepped forward. Mom's right, he said, his voice firm. Professional, the kind of voice he probably used in business meetings. Sophie's very sensitive to heat. She specifically requested that seat, but I saw it. The look he gave her. Quick, sharp, unmistakable. It said, agree with me, or else. And that's when the first real crack appeared in the pretty picture I'd been believing for 7 years. Because I knew my daughter. I'd raised her alone after her father died when she was 12. I knew every one of her tells, every quirk, every preference. And Sophie had always been cold-natured. Always. She'd wear sweaters in summer and complain about air conditioning being too high. There was no universe in which my daughter would choose to sit in the coldest spot in the room on Christmas night. Sophie, I said, still holding her, feeling her shake against me. Do you want to leave with me? Right now? The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour. I could feel everyone in that room holding their breath. Derek took a step toward us, his jaw tight. She's not going anywhere, he said, and there was an edge to his voice now. Sharp, dangerous. This is my home, my family. Sophie stays where I say she stays. Where I say she stays, like she was a piece of furniture. Like she was something he owned. I looked down at Sophie. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with tears. She was fighting hard not to let fall. And I saw something else. There's something that made my blood run cold. She was terrified. Not just uncomfortable or embarrassed. Actually, genuinely afraid. Sophie, I repeated, ignoring Derek completely. Look at me, baby. Do you want to come with me? For what felt like forever, she didn't move. I could see the war happening behind her eyes. Fear versus hope. Obligation versus survival. And then, so slowly, she nodded. Yes, she whispered, her voice cracking. I want to go with you, Mom. Derek moved to block our path to the door. But I'd spent 30 years in corporate America dealing with men who thought they could intimidate me. I'd negotiated million-dollar contracts and faced down executives twice my size. This spoiled rich boy didn't scare me. I met his eyes with a look that had made grown men reconsider their life choices. Move, I said quietly, or I call the police right now and tell them what I witnessed here tonight. He stepped aside. But his mother wasn't finished. You're making a terrible mistake, Patricia hissed, her composure finally cracking. Sophie is lucky to have Derek. She came from nothing, and we gave her everything. A beautiful home, stability, a respectable family, and this is how she repays us. Running off with her mother in the middle of Christmas. I froze, turned slowly. Nothing, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about one cold Christmas night. This was about 7 years of something much, much worse. What had they been doing to my daughter all this time while I believed she was happy? Patricia's words hung in the air like poison. She came from nothing. I wanted to explode right there, to list every single one of Sophie's accomplishments, but something stopped me. Sophie's hand gripped mine so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my palm. She wanted to leave now. I pulled her toward the door, and this time Derek didn't try to stop us. But as we passed through that marble foyer, I heard Patricia say something to the others in a voice just loud enough for us to hear, something about Sophie being ungrateful and mentally unstable. The word unstable made Sophie stumble. I steadied her and kept walking. The drive to the nearest hotel was silent, except for Sophie's shivering. Even with the heat on full blast, even wrapped in my coat, she couldn't stop shaking. I kept glancing over at her, seeing my confident, brilliant daughter reduced to this trembling shadow, and I felt something dark and furious coiling in my chest. We checked into a Holiday Inn 20 minutes away. I got us a room with 2 beds and immediately turned the thermostat up to 7. While Sophie sat on the bed, still wrapped in my coat, I went to the vending machine and got hot chocolate from the lobby. My hands were shaking as I stirred the powder into the hot water. I'd seen something tonight that I couldn't unsee. Back in the room, I handed her the cup and sat beside her. She held it with both hands, like it was a lifeline. And we sat there for maybe 10 minutes in silence. I didn't push. I learned a long time ago that people talk when they're ready, not when you demand it. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear her. She told me she was sorry. Sorry for lying. Sorry for pretending everything was fine during our phone calls. Sorry for canceling visits. Sorry for being weak. That last word made me pull her close. I told her she wasn't weak, that she had nothing to apologize for, and that I just needed her to tell me the truth. I'll have it. I'll have it. And then, like a dam breaking, it all came pouring out. It started small, she said. Little comments from Patricia about her clothes being too casual for family dinners. Suggestions that she smile less because it made her look unserious. Derek asking her to check with him before making plans with friends because the Whitmore family had certain social obligations. At first, it seemed like they were just trying to help her fit into their world, but then the rules got stricter. Patricia made a list of appropriate topics for Sophie to discuss at social events. Nothing too personal, nothing too opinionated. Definitely nothing about her work, because it made guests uncomfortable to talk about cancer research at dinner parties. Derek started controlling what she wore, what she ate, even how she styled her hair. The financial control came next. Derek convinced her to deposit her paychecks into a joint account that only he had access to. He said it was simpler that way, more efficient for a married couple. He was a finance guy. After all, he knew what he was doing. He gave her $200 a month for personal expenses and told her it was generous. $200. My daughter made $95,000 a year as a senior research scientist at one of the most prestigious pharmaceutical companies in the country, and her husband gave her $200 a month like she was a child getting an allowance. But the worst part, the part that made my vision go red, was what happened during family gatherings. They made her eat after everyone else finished, claiming the table was too crowded. They sat her in uncomfortable spots near drafty doors, away from heat sources, in chairs that were falling apart while everyone else had cushioned seats. And whenever she questioned it, Derek and Patricia told her she was being too sensitive, reading into things, imagining slights that weren't there. The word appeared in my mind with perfect clarity. They'd been systematically gaslighting my daughter for 7 years. Sophie cried as she talked, and I held her and let her get it all out. She told me about friends she'd lost because Derek said they were bad influences. About how she hadn't been home to visit me because there was always some Whitmore family event she couldn't miss. About how she'd started believing that maybe she really was too sensitive, too difficult, too ungrateful for the life they'd given her. When she finally stopped talking, it was past midnight. She fell asleep curled against me like she used to do when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. I sat there in that hotel room, listening to her breathe, and made a decision. I'd worked as vice president of human resources at Mercer Pharmaceuticals for 15 years. I made $240,000 a year. I had investments, savings, and a paid-off apartment in Beacon Hill with a spare bedroom that had been sitting empty since Sophie got married. I had resources, connections, and experience dealing with exactly this kind of manipulative behavior in corporate settings. And now, I was going to use every single bit of it to destroy the people who'd done this to my child. The next morning, Christmas Day, I made a call while Sophie was still sleeping. My best friend, Karen Rodriguez, answered on the second ring. I told her I needed her to come to the Holiday Inn in Westport immediately and to bring her divorce filing paperwork. Karen was a divorce attorney, one of the best in Boston, and she owed me a favor from when I'd helped her teenage son get into a substance abuse program 2 years ago. She didn't ask questions. She just said she'd be there in 2 hours. While I waited, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I went through Sophie's phone. She'd left it on the nightstand, and I knew her passcode because she'd never changed it from her childhood dog's name. I told myself I was looking for evidence, which was true, but I was also looking for confirmation that what I'd witnessed last night wasn't an isolated incident. What I found made me want to throw up. Hundreds of text messages from Derek. ordering her to come home from work early, demanding to know where she was and who she was with, telling her that her coworker James was too friendly and she needed to stop talking to him. Messages from Patricia with suggestions about Sophie's appearance, her behavior, her career choices, always phrased politely. But the underlying message was clear: Sophie wasn't good enough. Sophie needed to change. Sophie needed to be grateful. But the worst discovery was in her photos. Sophie had taken screenshots of her bank statements. I scrolled through them with growing horror. Derek had been taking her entire salary and depositing it into an account she couldn't access. But that wasn't all. He'd been using her money for his own investments. $47,000 of Sophie's earnings had gone into cryptocurrency investments that, according to the statements, had completely tanked. He'd lost nearly $50,000 of her money on digital coins, and she'd had no idea. That wasn't just financial control. That was theft. I heard Sophie stirring and quickly put the phone back. When she woke up, I told her Karen was coming. She looked scared but also relieved, like she'd been waiting for someone to tell her it was okay to fight back. Karen arrived with a leather briefcase and a grim expression. She sat down with Sophie and asked questions for 3 hours straight. She took notes on everything, every incident, every text message, every dollar Derek had controlled. She photographed the marks on Sophie's arms from sitting in the cold. She documented everything with the precision of someone building a case. Finally, Karen looked up at me and smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who'd just spotted weak prey. She told us she had more than enough for a divorce filing based on financial abuse and coercive control. But she also had something else. She said that what Derek had done with Sophie's salary, depositing it in an account he controlled and using it for investments without her consent, was called spousal financial exploitation. In some cases, it was criminal fraud. She asked Sophie if she wanted to go after him. Really go after him, not just for divorce, but for everything he'd taken from her. Her money, her autonomy, her 7 years. Sophie looked at me with tears in her eyes. Then she looked at Karen and nodded. And that's when we started planning how to take down Derek Whitmore and his entire toxic family. But there was one piece of evidence we hadn't found yet, one that would prove Derek had been planning this from the very beginning. 2 days after Christmas, we drove back to the Whitmore mansion. This time, we weren't alone. Karen sat in the back seat with a briefcase full of legal documents. A police officer named Martinez followed us in his patrol car. Unfolded in my purse was a court order allowing Sophie to retrieve her personal belongings from the marital home. The look on Derek's face when he opened the door and saw all of us standing there, that's an image I'll treasure forever. The color drained right out of his cheeks. He'd probably spent the last 2 days convincing himself that Sophie would come crawling back, apologizing for embarrassing him in front of his family. Instead, she stood there in jeans and my old college sweatshirt, flanked by a lawyer and a cop, with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. Strength. Derek tried to block the doorway. He said something about this being his house and us having no right to be there. Karen simply held up the court order, and Officer Martinez explained very calmly that Derek could either let us in or be charged with obstruction. Derek moved aside. The next 4 hours were surreal. Sophie walked through that massive house pointing out what was hers, and I helped her pack. Derek followed us from room to room, his voice getting louder and more desperate with each box we filled. He kept saying Sophie couldn't just leave their marriage, that they had a life together, that she was throwing away everything they'd built. Karen had instructed Sophie not to engage, so she didn't. She just kept packing. But I watched Derek carefully, studying the way he operated, and I noticed something interesting. The more Sophie ignored him, the more frantic he became. He wasn't sad. He wasn't heartbroken. He was panicking, like someone who'd just realized their careful plan was falling apart. Patricia showed up about an hour into the packing. She swept into the house like a winter storm, immediately demanding to know what was happening. When Karen explained that Sophie was retrieving her belongings as part of divorce proceedings, Patricia turned to Sophie with this look of betrayed shock. She said Sophie was making the biggest mistake of her life, that Derek had given her everything, that no one else would want her after this, that the Whitmore name meant something in Connecticut, and Sophie was nothing without it. I was about to step in, but Sophie spoke first. Her voice was calm, and steady. She said they'd had a contract. Yes, a marriage contract, but Derek had violated that contract repeatedly by controlling her finances without consent, isolating her from her family, and subjecting her to degrading treatment. She said her lawyer had documented everything. The look on Patricia's face was priceless. Pure shock, like she couldn't believe Sophie was capable of putting together a coherent sentence, let alone fighting back. Karen stepped forward and handed Derek a manila envelope. She explained very precisely what was inside a divorce petition citing financial abuse and emotional manipulation, and then she added something that made Derek go pale. She told him they'd be notifying his employer about certain financial irregularities, the misuse of marital funds, the cryptocurrency investments made with Sophie's money without her knowledge or consent. She used the word embezzlement very carefully and deliberately. Derek's hands shook as he opened the envelope. For the first time, I saw actual fear in his eyes. He asked what she was talking about, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen explained it simply. Sophie's salary had been deposited into an account Derek controlled exclusively. He hadn't properly disclosed this income on their joint tax returns. He'd used her funds for personal investments without authorization. These weren't just civil matters, they were potentially criminal. And then Karen dropped the real bomb. She said Derek's employer, Whitmore & Associates investment firm, his family's own company, would need to be notified because this behavior indicated a pattern of financial misconduct that could expose them to liability. Derek's face went from pale to gray. He started saying it was a misunderstanding, that Sophie had agreed to everything, that he could explain. But his voice had that edge of desperation that told me Karen had hit something important. We kept packing. In Sophie's closet, I found boxers of clothes she'd never worn, expensive designer pieces that Patricia had bought for her. Degzi, she won't. Sophie said Patricia gave her those clothes and then criticized her for not wearing them, saying she was wasteful and ungrateful. Another manipulation tactic. In Derek's home office room, Sophie said she wasn't normally allowed to enter. We found the bank statements, boxes of them. Karen put on gloves and started photographing everything with her phone. And that's when we found the journal. It was leather-bound and expensive looking, tucked in a drawer of Patricia's old desk that Derek had inherited. The handwriting inside was Patricia's, page after page of observations about Sophie, dates, times, and detailed descriptions of what Patricia called behavioral issues. Sophie laughed too loudly at dinner on March 14th. Sophie made inappropriate eye contact with male guests at the charity gala. Sophie wore red lipstick, which was too attention. Sophie discussed her cancer research work with donors, making them uncomfortable. On and on and on. 7 years of surveillance. 7 years of documenting every tiny thing Sophie did that didn't meet Patricia Whitmore's impossible standards. Karen photographed every page, but we still hadn't found what I was looking for. I knew there had to be more. The way Derek had panicked when Karen mentioned his employer, the fear in his eyes. There was something else. Something bigger. Officer Martinez had been standing quietly by the door, but now he cleared his throat. He said we had another 2 hours before the court order expired, so we should make sure we got everything we needed. The way he said it there was an emphasis on everything. Like he was trying to tell us something. I looked around Derek's office more carefully. Expensive desk, leather chair, bookshelves full of finance books he'd probably never read, a laptop sitting closed on the desk, and a phone plugged into the charger on the side table. Derek's phone, just sitting there, unlocked. Derek and Patricia were in the living room having a heated, whispered conversation. Sophie was in the bedroom packing her books. Karen was photographing documents, and I was standing 3 feet from Derek's phone. I looked at Officer Martinez. He was very deliberately looking the other way, studying a painting on the wall with intense interest. I picked up the phone. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through his messages. Most of it was boring work stuff and texts to his parents. But then I found a conversation with someone named Brandon, Derek's brother, and I found a thread from 3 months before Derek and Sophie's wedding. Brandon had asked Derek if he was sure about marrying Sophie. Derek's response made my blood boil. He'd said of course he was sure. Sophie had an incredible job at the pharmaceutical company. The salary was phenomenal. She'd help him pay off the mortgage on the house he'd just bought. And best of all, she was docile enough that she wouldn't question when he took control of things. He said Sophie was the perfect solution to his financial problems, a high earner with low self. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding, but there was no other way to interpret it. Derek had married Sophie specifically because she made good money, and he thought he could control her. This wasn't a marriage. It was a financial strategy. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I quickly forwarded the entire conversation thread to my own number, then deleted the sent message from Derek's phone. Then I took screenshots of everything else I could find. Messages between Derek and Patricia discussing Sophie's attitude problems. Texts where Derek bragged to friends about how much money he was making from his investment, funded by Sophie's salary. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it just as Derek walked back into the office. He looked at me suspiciously, but I was standing by the bookshelf, holding one of Sophie's framed photos. I asked him calmly if this was hers. He said yes. I put it in a box. When we finally left that house 4 hours later, we took 17 boxers, 3 suitcases, and enough evidence to bury Derek Whitmore. But the most valuable thing I took was in my phone. A text message that proved Derek had planned this entire thing from the beginning, that he'd hunted my daughter deliberately because she was vulnerable and profitable. Karen saw my face as we loaded the last box into the trunk. She asked if I'd found something. I told her I'd show her back at my apartment. But first, I needed to make sure this evidence was backed up in 3 different places because I had a feeling Derek was going to try very hard to make it disappear. As we drove away, I looked back at that mansion in my rearview mirror. Derek stood in the doorway, watching us leave, his phone in his hand, and I wondered how long it would take him to realize that the evidence he'd been stupid enough to save on his device was now in my possession. The answer would come sooner than I expected. Then his reaction would show me just how dangerous cornered predators can be. We made it back to my apartment in Beacon Hill by 8 p.m. Sophie collapsed on the couch, exhausted from the emotional weight of walking through 7 years of her life and packing it into boxers. Karen and I went into my home office and closed the door. I showed her the screenshots from Derek's phone, the conversation with his brother about marrying Sophie for her salary, the messages with Patricia plotting how to keep Sophie isolated and compliant, the texts bragging about his cryptocurrency investments funded entirely by my daughter's hard-earned money. Karen read everything twice, then she looked up at me with eyes that had gone cold and calculating. She said this changed everything. This wasn't just a divorce case anymore. This was evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, premeditated financial exploitation. Derek had entered the marriage with criminal intent. She asked me how I'd gotten the messages. I told her the truth. I'd found his phone unlocked and taken screenshots. Karen nodded slowly. She said it might not be admissible in criminal court, but it didn't matter. We weren't going to criminal court. Not yet. Anyway, what we were going to do was much more effective. Karen explained her strategy. Derek worked at his family's investment firm, a prestigious company that managed hundreds of millions in client assets. They had a reputation to protect, and firms like that had zero tolerance for employees who demonstrated patterns of financial misconduct, even if that misconduct happened in their personal lives, especially if it involved fraudulent control of marital assets. She said we'd send a carefully worded letter to the compliance department at Whitmore and Associates. Nothing accusatory. Just a professional notification that Derek Whitmore was party to divorce proceedings involving allegations of financial impropriety, and the firm might want to conduct an internal review to ensure no client funds had been similarly mishandled. The beauty of it was that we didn't have to prove anything. The mere suggestion of ethical violations would trigger a mandatory internal investigation. And once they started looking, they'd find things. Men who steal from their wives rarely limit their dishonesty to home. But Karen said we needed more than just the phone messages. We needed Sophie's full cooperation and her complete financial records. Every pay stub, every bank statement, every piece of documentation showing where her money went for 7 years. Sophie came into the office then, holding a cup of tea with shaking hands. She'd overheard through the door. She said she wanted to help, wanted to give us everything we needed. But then her voice dropped to almost a whisper. She told us there was something else we should know. Something she'd been too ashamed to admit earlier. 3 years ago, Derek had made her sign papers. He'd said it was just a formality, something about refinancing the house. She'd been at work when he called, stressed and rushing between meetings. He'd met her in the parking lot of her lab with documents and a notary. She'd signed without reading carefully because he'd told her it was urgent and she trusted him. Karen's expression went very still. She asked Sophie if she had copies of what she signed. Sophie shook her head. She said Derek told her he'd filed everything and she didn't need to worry about it. But she remembered the notary's name because it was unusual Gladys Chun. She remembered because they'd talked about the woman's beautiful jade bracelet while Sophie signed. Karen was already typing on her laptop. She said if those documents were notarized, there'd be a record. And if Derek had made Sophie sign something without explaining what it was, that could be grounds for invalidating it. She asked what Sophie thought the papers were about. Sophie's voice got even quieter. She said one of them might have been a post-nuptial agreement. She'd seen those words at the top of one page, but Derek had rushed her. Said they were late for the notary's appointment, that it was just standard stuff their lawyer recommended. My stomach dropped. A post-nuptial agreement signed under pressure without legal counsel. If Derek had manipulated Sophie into signing away her rights to marital assets 3 years ago, he'd been planning his exit strategy or his protection strategy for a very long time. Karen made 3 phone calls that night. 1 to a forensic accountant she'd worked with on complex divorce cases, 1 to a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud, and 1 to her contact at the Massachusetts Bar Association's ethics hotline. By midnight, we had a team. And by morning, Derek would realize he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated what a mother would do to protect her child. The forensic accountant's name was Michael Chun, no relation to the notary. Just a coincidence that made Sophie smile for the first time in days. He arrived at my apartment the next morning with 2 laptops and a briefcase full of portable hard drives. Michael looked like someone's gentle grandfather, but Karen had warned me he was ruthless. He'd taken down 3 executives for embezzlement in the past year alone. When he sat down at my dining table and started reviewing Sophie's financial records, his expression never changed. But I saw his jaw tighten when he found the cryptocurrency transactions. He worked for 6 hours straight. Sophie and I brought him coffee and sandwiches, but he barely touched them. Finally, around 4 in the afternoon, he called us over to look at his laptop screen. What he'd found was worse than we'd imagined. Derek hadn't just stolen $47,000 for failed crypto investments. Over 7 years, he'd systematically siphoned nearly $215,000 from Sophie's earnings into accounts and investments she knew nothing about. Some of it went to crypto, some went to high-risk stock options that crashed, but a significant portion, about $80,000, had gone into a separate savings account under only Derek's name. He'd been building a nest egg with her money, preparing for something. Michael showed us the pattern. Every few months, Derek would transfer large chunks from the joint account into his private investments. Always when Sophie was traveling for work conferences, always in amounts just small enough that they wouldn't trigger automatic bank alerts. He'd been careful, methodical. This wasn't impulsive theft. This was calculated extraction. But Michael had found something else. The post-nuptial agreement Sophie had signed 3 years ago wasn't just about protecting Derek's assets. It had a clause stating that in the event of divorce, Sophie would waive her right to any claims of financial misconduct during the marriage. Essentially, Derek had made her sign away her ability to sue him for exactly what he'd been doing. Karen read the document with her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she said one word that made my heart leap voidable. She explained that contracts signed under duress or without proper legal representation could be challenged. Sophie had signed in a parking lot, rushed and pressured, with no lawyer present to explain what she was agreeing to. The notary's testimony would be crucial. If Gladys Chun remembered Sophie seeming confused or rushed, we could argue the agreement was invalid. The private investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Maria Torres, found Gladys Chun in 2 days. She'd retired from notary work but remembered the incident clearly. She told Maria that she'd felt uncomfortable during that signing. The husband had been pushy, repeatedly telling the wife to hurry up. The wife had asked what one of the clauses meant, and the husband had cut her off and said his lawyer had already explained everything. Gladys had made notes in her records about feeling the signing was irregular. She'd even written "wife appeared uncertain" in her log. That note was gold. Maria also found something else. She'd been surveilling the Whitmore mansion for 3 days, and she'd noticed something interesting. Derek and Patricia were having screaming arguments. Neighbors had heard them. One argument had been so loud that someone almost called the police. Maria had managed to talk to the housekeeper who worked next door. The woman said she'd overheard Patricia blaming Derek for destroying the family reputation, saying his father Howard was furious. Something about Derek's firm starting an investigation. Our letter to Whitmore and Associates Compliance Department had worked faster than expected. Karen scheduled a meeting with Derek's lawyers for the following week. She said we'd present our evidence, the financial records, the coerced postnuptial agreement, the notary's testimony, everything. We'd offer Derek a choice. He could settle the divorce quietly and pay back every penny he'd stolen with interest, plus damages for emotional distress. Or we could go public with everything, including notifying the SEC about his pattern of financial fraud. Sophie asked what would happen if he chose to fight. Karen smiled that predator smile again. She said if Derek wanted to fight, we'd destroy him in court and then pursue criminal charges. His choice? That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She kept asking if we were doing the right thing. If maybe she was being too harsh. If Derek might have had reasons she didn't understand. I held her hand and told her something I'd learned in 30 years of corporate HR work. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, when they prove they've been using you systematically for years, believing their words over their behavior isn't kindness, it's self-destruction. The meeting with Derek's lawyers was set for January 5th. We had 8 days to prepare. But Derek had other plans. His next move would show us just how far he'd go to protect his secrets. On January 12th, 3 days before our scheduled meeting with Derek's lawyers, Sophie's phone started ringing at 2 in the morning. I woke to the sound of her crying in the next room. Derek had sent her a text message. Along Wang, ha! It started with apologies and claims that he loved her, that this was all a misunderstanding, that his family had pressured him into treating her poorly. He said he wanted to fix things, that they could go to counseling, that he'd give her access to all the accounts. But the last paragraph was different. It was a threat barely disguised as concern. He wrote that he'd hate for her colleagues at the pharmaceutical company to find out about her mental health struggle, that it would be terrible if her boss learned she'd been having emotional breakdowns at work, that maybe the stress of the divorce was making her unstable, and perhaps she needed psychiatric evaluation before making any major legal decisions. None of it was true. Sophie had never had mental health issues. She'd never had breakdowns at work. But Derek was planting seeds, creating a narrative where Sophie was unreliable, emotionally compromised, not to be trusted. It was gaslighting, taken to its logical extreme. If he couldn't control her anymore, he'd destroy her credibility. Sophie was terrified. She worked in a competitive field where reputation was everything. Even false accusations could derail years of research, cost her professional relationships, damage her standing in the scientific community. Derek knew exactly where she was vulnerable. I called Karen at 2:30 in the morning. She answered, immediate. Edivor's lawyers are used to crisis calls. She told me to forward her the text and not to respond to Derek at all. Then she said something that made me sit up straight. She asked if I remembered giving her permission to use any legal means necessary to protect Sophie. I said yes. She told me she'd been saving our trump card for the right moment, and Derek had just forced our hand. At 9 a.m., Karen, Sophie, and I sat in Karen's office downtown. Karen opened her laptop and pulled up a video file. She said her private investigator Maria had done some additional digging into Derek's professional life. What she'd found would end this quickly. She pressed play. The video was security footage from Whitmore and Associates offices, dated 8 months ago. It showed Derek at his desk late at night when the office was empty. He was on his computer, and the camera angle was clear enough to see his screen. He was transferring money between client accounts, moving funds from one portfolio to another, covering losses in one account with gains from another. It was called commingling, and it was completely illegal. Maria had gotten the footage from a disgruntled IT employee who'd been fired from Whitmore and Associates 2 months ago. The employee had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known what to do with the information. When Maria approached him, as part of her investigation into Derek's personal finances, he'd handed over the security footage without hesitation. Karen explained what we were seeing. Derek had been using client funds to cover his personal investment losses. When his cryptocurrency bets failed, when his risky stock options crashed, he'd been dipping into the accounts he managed to make up the difference. It was a shell game, moving money around to hide the gaps. And it was securities fraud. The forensic accountant Michael had suspected something like this when he saw the pattern in Derek's personal accounts. But without access to Derek's professional records, he hadn't been able to prove it. Now we had proof, Karen said. We had two options. We could turn this footage over to the SEC and let federal investigators destroy Derek's career and possibly send him to prison. Or we could use it as leverage to get Sophie everything she deserved in the divorce and ensure Derek never bothered her again. Sophie stared at the screen. I could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of her was horrified. Part of her was relieved, and part of her, the part that had been controlled and diminished for 7 years, was angry. She asked what would happen to Derek's clients if we reported him. Karen said the SEC would freeze his accounts, investigate all his transactions, and make sure clients were reimbursed. It would destroy Whitmore and Associates' reputation, but the clients would be protected. Sophie was quiet for a long time. Then she said she wanted Derek to face consequences for what he'd done. Not just to her, but to the people who'd trusted him with their money. She said if he could steal from her so easily, he'd probably stolen from others too. I'd never been prouder of my daughter. Karen made the call to Derek's lawyer right there in the office. She put it on speaker. She told him we were moving up the meeting to today, 3 p.m. at her office, non-negotiable. And she strongly suggested that Derek attend personally. Derek's lawyer started to argue about scheduling conflicts. Karen cut him off. She said we had video evidence of Derek committing securities fraud, and he had until 3 p.m. to settle this divorce on our terms, or we'd turn that evidence over to federal authorities. She gave him the timestamp of the security footage so he'd know we weren't bluffing. The line went silent for several seconds. Then the lawyer said they'd be there at 3. At 2:45 p.m., Derek walked into Karen's conference room with his lawyer and his father Howard. Derek looked like he hadn't slept in days. His expensive suit was wrinkled. Howard looked furious, but not anxious. At Derek, Karen laid out the terms. Derek would pay Sophie $400,000, the $215,000 he'd stolen, plus interest and damages. He would sign over his half of the house, which Sophie would immediately sell, giving her another $340,000. He would publicly acknowledge the divorce was his fault, citing irreconcilable differences caused by his financial misconduct, and he would never contact Sophie again. Ever. In exchange, we wouldn't turn the security footage over to the SEC yet. Derek started to argue. His lawyer put a hand on his arm to shut him up. Howard spoke instead. He said Derek would accept the terms, all of them, and that Derek would be resigning from Whitmore and Associates effective immediately. The look on Derek's face told me everything. His father had already cut him loose. The family that had treated Sophie like property was throwing Derek away the moment he became a liability. Within 30 minutes, the papers were signed. And just like that, 7 years of abuse ended with Derek's signature on a settlement agreement and the sound of him walking out of that office alone. Today is October 28, 2027, almost 2 years since that meeting in Karen's office. I'm sitting in my living room in Beacon Hill watching Sophie get ready for a date, and I still can't quite believe how much has changed. The divorce was finalized in May, 3 months after Derek signed the settlement. He paid every penny he owed. The $400,000 in restitution came in certified checks that Sophie deposited into an account only she controlled. The house in Connecticut sold quickly, and Sophie got her half of that money too. In total, she walked away with $740,000. But the money was never really the point. The point was freedom. Derek's life fell apart exactly the way you'd expect. Howard forced him to resign from Whitmore and Associates before the board could vote him out. The official story was that Derek was pursuing other opportunities, but everyone in Connecticut's financial circles knew the truth. Maria's IT contact had made sure of that by anonymously leaking just enough information to the right people. Derek tried to get hired at other investment firms, but his reputation preceded him. Last I heard, he was working at some third-tier company in New Jersey, making a fraction of what he used to earn. Patricia stopped speaking to him for 8 months, furious that he'd destroyed the family name she'd spent decades building. The country club membership was revoked. The social invitations dried up. Sometimes Sophie asks me if she should feel guilty about what happened to him. I always tell her the same thing: Derek destroyed himself. We just refuse to be silent about it. The real story is what happened to Sophie. She still lives with me in the Beacon Hill apartment, though that's changing soon. She's been saving aggressively, and she just put an offer on a beautiful brownstone in the South End. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a kitchen with enough light to grow the herb garden she's always wanted. She's closing next month. Her career flourished once she was free from Derek's control. 6 months after the divorce, she was promoted to director of research at her pharmaceutical company. Her salary jumped to $145,000, and this time every penny goes into accounts with only her name on them. She's leading a team developing a new treatment for pancreatic cancer, and last month they got preliminary FDA approval to move to human trials. But the biggest change isn't professional, it's personal. About a year ago, Sophie started dating someone new. His name is James, the same co-worker Derek had been jealous of, though Derek's suspicions were wrong back then. James is a fellow researcher, quiet and kind, with this gentle way of checking in with Sophie about everything. He asks if she's comfortable, if she's warm enough, if she needs anything. Not in a patronizing way, in a way that shows he actually cares about her answer. The first time James came to dinner at my apartment, I watched him carefully, old habits from 7 years of not seeing what was happening to Sophie. But within 10 minutes, I knew he was different. He asked Sophie about her research with genuine interest and listened carefully to her answers. When she got excited talking about her work, he smiled and encouraged her to keep going. He pulled out a chair for her near the fireplace and asked 3 times if she was warm enough. Not because he was controlling where she sat, but because it was January, and he'd noticed she got cold easily. Sophie looked at me across the table with tears in her eyes. Happy tears. The kind that come when you finally understand what you deserved all along. James proposed last month. Sophie said yes, but she also said they're waiting at least another year before getting married. She wants to be sure. She wants to know herself fully as an independent person before becoming someone's wife again. James didn't just understand, he agreed it was wise. That's how I know he's the right one. Because the right person doesn't rush you into anything. They walk beside you at whatever pace you need. As for me, this experience changed something in me too. I'd spent 30 years working in corporate HR, and I thought I understood manipulation and abuse, but I'd missed it happening to my own daughter right under my nose. That reality haunts me sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, but it also taught me something crucial. The most dangerous abusers are the ones who look perfect on the surface, the ones in expensive houses with respectable families and impressive careers, the ones who gaslight so effectively that even the victim doubts their own reality. I've started volunteering with an organization that helps women escape financially abusive relationships. I use my HR background to help them document abuse, understand their rights, and navigate divorce proceedings. Karen volunteers her legal services at a reduced rate. Between us, we've helped 19 women in the past year. Every single one of them says the same thing. Sophie said they didn't realize what was happening until someone from the outside pointed it out. They thought they were crazy, too sensitive, ungrateful. The abusers had convinced them that reality was something different than what they were experiencing. Last week, one of the women we're helping asked me how I knew to go to my daughter that Christmas night, how I knew something was wrong when Sophie had been hiding it so successfully for years. I told her the truth. A mother knows, maybe not the details, maybe not the full picture, but there's a frequency that mothers are tuned to, a signal that gets sent when your child is hurting. I'd been hearing static on that frequency for months before that Christmas. I just hadn't known how to interpret it until I saw Sophie shivering in that corner. Sophie just walked into the living room wearing a blue dress I've never seen before. She looks radiant. Happy, whole. James is picking her up in 20 minutes for dinner at a new restaurant she's been wanting to try. She's excited, not anxious about what he'll think of her outfit or worried about saying the wrong thing. Just excited. She sits next to me on the couch and takes my hand. She thanks me for that Christmas night, for coming to get her even though she'd told me not to, for believing her when she finally told the truth. for fighting for her when she was too exhausted to fight for herself. I tell her what I've told her 100 times before she saved herself. I just drove the car. The doorbell rings. James is early, holding flowers. Not expensive roses designed to impress, but sunflowers, because he knows they're Sophie's favorites. These small things matter. These small things are everything. After they leave, I sit in my quiet apartment and think about that night 2 years ago. About finding Sophie trembling in that mansion. About the fear in her eyes and the relief when I said we were leaving. About how close I came to not going, to respecting her request to stay away, to believing the pretty picture she'd been painting in our phone calls. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust your instincts when everything else tells you you're wrong. Sometimes saving someone means forcing your way into spaces where you're not welcome. And sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family that protects you, it's the one you choose or reclaim when you finally recognize what love actually looks like. My daughter came from nothing. Patricia Whitmore said that Christmas night she was wrong. Sophie came from strength. She came from resilience. She came from a mother who worked herself to exhaustion to give her daughter opportunities. And when Sophie stumbled, when she fell into a trap disguised as love, she had something to come back to. She had a home where she was valued, a mother who would drive through snowstorms to reach her, and the courage, buried deep after 7 years of suppression, to finally say yes when someone offered her a way out. Derek Whitmore thought he could own my daughter. He thought her kindness was weakness and her trust was stupidity. He thought wrong. And now he sits in his small office in New Jersey, probably wondering how it all fell apart so quickly. How the perfect plan marry the smart girl with the good salary, control her money, build his nest egg, keep her isolated and compliance shattered in the span of 3 months. I'll tell you how. It fell apart because he underestimated what happens when you hurt someone's child. He underestimated the resources and rage of a mother who spent 30 years learning how to fight. And most of all, he underestimated Sophie herself, the brilliant, resilient woman who'd been hiding under all that fear, just waiting for permission to stand up. Some people ask me if I think Derek learned anything from all this, if he understands what he did wrong. I honestly don't know, and I don't particularly care. My concern was never with fixing Derek. It was with freeing Sophie. And she's free now, free to choose her own furniture and her own friends and her own future. Free to sit by the fireplace instead of shivering in corners. Free to keep her own money and make her own decisions and say no without fear. That's what victory looks like. Not revenge, not punishment, just freedom and the space to heal. If you're reading this and seeing yourself in Sophie's story, if you recognize the pattern of control and gaslighting and financial manipulation, I want you to know something. You're not crazy. You're not too sensitive. You're not imagining it. And you deserve so much more than what you're getting. Find your person, your mother, your friend, your sister, your advocate. The one who will drive through snowstorms to reach you. And when they extend their hand and ask if you want to leave, say yes. Say yes and don't look back. So tell me, where in the world are you hearing this story from? Drop your city in the comments. I'd love to know how far these words have traveled. And if this story resonated with you, if it helped you see something clearly that was foggy before, consider following along. There are more stories where this came from. Stories of survival and strength and second chances. Because sometimes the best gift you can give someone is witnessing their truth and believing them when they finally have the courage to speak it.